more properly. So Johan is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He is the author of Margins of the Market, obviously, as well as numerous articles on histories of capitalism in the Indian Ocean world. He's currently writing a new book, very exciting, tentatively entitled Opiates of the Masses, a biography of human capital, which explores the history of narcotics consumption as a means of understanding how human beings become human capital. If you're really interested in that project, Johan will actually be talking about it tomorrow on the picket lines as a teach out at 12 noon. So I highly recommend you come to that. Okay, thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Johan.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to all of you for coming here. I know the schedule was changed. We're all gearing up for the strike. Spain and Costa Rica are playing, so I appreciate your being here. And I do want to thank Henny, Metin, Sarah, Joao, everyone who's been involved in bringing me here and organizing this really fantastic series. I'll also just quickly mention that it's nice to be back at SOAS. I spent a year here, 16 years ago. I'm dating myself. When there was still a Vernon Square campus, and there were £1 samosas in the student union. So it's wonderful to be back here and to present my work to this audience. So this book was published 6 years ago, which in the sort of timescales of academic publishing is like the blink of an eye, but in real human lives, it's a long time. In between, I've changed jobs, had a child. We've all been through a global pandemic, and so a lot of water has kind of flowed under the bridge, and I'm steadily working on this sort of new project. And all of that is really to say that I have a little bit of distance from this book. I don't feel that kind of protective. It's my baby, and I'm gonna get all nervous if you criticize it, because I'm actually it's its own thing now. It goes out in the world and it talks to people, and I have no idea what they're reading out of this book, and so I do want to sort of say, please be free to be critical and be honest and frank about what you think works and what you think doesn't work in the book. I'm really interested, as much if not more, to hear your sort of problems with the book than sort of praise, which is never as useful. So in that kind of spirit, I'm going to sort of take the benefit of hindsight and talk about a few of the kind of regrets that I have about the book and how it's kind of driving the work that I'm doing right now. Okay, so the first thing I'll say when I was sort of finishing this book back in 2000, sort of 15, I was very nervous that it wouldn't get published, or that it wouldn't get published in the right kind of place that would get me tenure and all of these sorts of things. And so I was very anxious that it be a book that's readable, accessible to a broader audience. And I worked very hard to sort of tone down some of the sort of theories and conceptual things that were going around in my head in order to make it this more accessible book. And in some ways, I think that was successful. Many people tell me that it was sort of accessible and readable, and they enjoyed reading it. At least academics. I don't know if real people feel that way, but that I think has some benefit. But I also sort of look back and I kind of wish I'd written an introduction that was like 3 times as long, that sort of pulled out all of the sort of things that were in my head that I was kind of scared to put on the page, because I thought no one will read it. And so I can't in the 15 minutes that I have left, to walk you through all of the sort of conceptual material that the book was going through my mind as I was thinking about these ideas. That hopefully you picked up on some of them in the introduction. This idea of sort of framing out and the performativity of economics and these kinds of questions. But I want to sort of throw that out there in a sense. I'm interested to hear what you thought about that, what you didn't understand, what you thought was missing, and hopefully in the Q&A we can sort of think through some of those questions together. I often get, I feel like, especially a kind of Marxist audience, pushes me on some of those questions because I'm not taking a sort of standard line and coming at it from this other angle, and that doesn't always go over well. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. Okay, another sort of missed opportunity, I think, in this book was the relative absence of gender analysis. Now, I think that there's lots of pieces while I was doing this research that hopefully are there if you read the sort of the chapter on slavery, right? The role of sort of racialized ideas of femininity are actually really important to the way that the slave trade is operating. And there are other sort of places where I was thinking about some of these things, but they didn't really get developed conceptually and theoretically, and that's something that I kind of regret. And part of the story is, of course, that this was the world of maritime trade is a very masculine world, right? It's full of sailors and arms smugglers and all these sorts of things. And I think there's was an opening there to think about masculinity. Why is the sea sort of seen as a sort of masculine place? And then why is the black market and smuggling seen as a sort of particularly kind of hyper-masculine space, right? And those are questions that I weren't in my head when I was writing this. But I would, if I were to go back and think through those questions, I think, it would have improved the book. It may have made it a different book, but nonetheless, those are sort of questions that I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts on, but also shape the work that I'm doing now. And so the current project is on narcotics and human capital, and I'm thinking much more seriously about gender in this project, and there's a couple of ways that it kind of works. One is that narcotics like opium and cannabis seem to be needed more in sort of spaces where domestic life is lacking, right? So in barracks and in these kind of masculine space, labor camps and things like that, where people aren't really allowed to have a home life, where there aren't usually the women who are doing the care work, right, of nursing and feeding and these sorts of things. In those spaces, narcotics seem to play a larger role. And I think that narcotics serve as a kind of substitute for human care, right? Now, that care need not necessarily be gendered, but we certainly, in the world that I'm looking at, it was a deeply gendered thing. And so narcotics are this kind of false substitutes for the labor of care work. Another thing that I see in the research that I'm doing right now is that at first glance, if you read archival sources or public writing, everyone assumes that women don't take drugs, right? And unless they're bad women, right? Prostitutes, mostly prostitutes. But if you sort of scratch under the surface, you quickly sort of see the highly gendered ways that narcotics are consumed. And so they're not doing it in public, but they're doing it in private, right? And a medicalized frame of I'm taking opium or I'm taking a cannabis tea, right, to help me with X, Y, or Z is very accepted and widely used by women. And so that issue of, right, narcotics as pleasure versus as medicine plays a really interesting role in what I'm sort of thinking through in terms of how this shapes human bodies and human labor. You also I have a chapter on women, mothers who work in factories who give opium or laudanum to their infant child, right? So they can go to the factory to work, or they bring the child with them and they, right, put the child in a corner, sleeping away, so that they can labor, right? So all of these ways in which it's used in highly gendered ways. Okay, so that's one big sort of thing that I regret, and I'm now trying to sort of think through in my new work. The third and last thing that I'll talk about is I sort of regret not thinking more about the question of inequality and to a certain extent sort of class in margins of the market. Ultimately, it's a book about colonial officials and merchants, right? And they have this kind of conflict with each other. There's lots of other people. There's enslaved people. There's sailors. There's dock workers. But they're kind of marginal to the main kind of conflict between these two figures. And that's a kind of natural consequence of the sources that I had. And it's, in a sense, a natural consequence of all documented written sources in societies that are overwhelmingly illiterate societies, right? And I did, I don't know if you caught this right in the introduction, I made this caveat that, this is not supposed to glorify smugglers, right? These are people who are literally trading human beings. And so I don't want people to sort of come away with that sense, but I think there's a kind of substructure in which you sticking it to the man, right? Those smugglers are, undermining, subverting colonialism, and that's something we're usually quite for, right? And that's true, but it's also done at the expense of people below them, and that sort of, I think, gets lost a little bit in this sort of main conflict that sort of frames the book. And, again, I think, these were issues that I thought about and that one struggles with as one writes a book, right? You have to make the story clear and comprehensible. And so you need to sort of, step all of the other complexities aside so that you can convey a clear point. And that's good, but it's also bad. So that's one of the sort of struggles that I had, and so in this new work, I am focusing much more explicitly on manual physical labor, and thinking about human beings and human bodies as they are treated as devices for the production of profit. And in one hand, this is a sort of return to a very kind of old school labor history and sort of social history. But I'm sort of particularly attuned to what Marxist feminists talk about as the reproduction of labor power, the reproduction of the laborer, right? All of that work or that time that people are spending eating, sleeping, drinking, smoking, fornicating, all of these sorts of things that they do outside of the workplace are in some way sort of generating the energy, the body, the capacity for for labor. And I think that we can think about that process, or it's useful to think about that process as a kind of investment in human capital. Now, obviously, human capital is a big and problematic framing that has all kinds of problems going on there. And I'm not saying that this is how we should look at it, but I think it's a really powerful way of understanding what's going on, because I think a lot of the employers were looking at their employees in this way. And so, they care about, are their workers being fed enough? Right? Are their workers sleeping enough? Right? All of the stuff that we hear today about human capital, like, oh, you've got to care for your workers so that they can be more productive, right? That's there 100 years ago when a mine owner, Cecil Rhodes, is thinking about how to run his gold mine in the WRCHR, right? That's happening because they are all of those workers are living in compounds on the mines and are every day their labor is regenerated by the decisions that their employers are making. So this is where, right, the other part of this story, which I think is really useful about human capital, perhaps opposed to a notion of abstract labor, which is that human capital allows for and assumes differences between people, differences that are often, right, women are less productive than men, right? Black people are less productive than white people. Chinese people are more productive than Malay people, right? These ideas are there in the way that employers are thinking about their labors, that the amount that people are being paid for their labor, that's justified along the lines of questions of productivity. Right, and that certain people are particularly good at certain kinds of jobs, and so in that way, I think human capital, though it sort of really develops in the kind of 1960s in the U.S. Academy, I think it has really strong currents of eugenicism that kind of lead up to it, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to think about. So in this, when we're here in the honor of Walter Rodney, right, I think these are important questions to explore, and how I'm at least trying to kind of think through them. That's not a great place to end, but I think I'll just shut up there. So yeah.
Thank you, Johan. That was really great, and really great to hear about both kind of the first and the second project and how they relate to one another. So yeah, I'm sure we'll make some time in Q&A to kind of address both. Let's hand it over to our respondents. Do you guys have a particular order? Yudon. All right, so the floor is yours, Yudon.
Thank you for your book talk. Because we only got 5 minutes per person, so I will try to limit my response to make it as quick as possible. So I think for me, the two things I found interesting from this book. Shut. All right.
Can people hear at the back? No, we need to.
Oh. The first thing is the fictionality or the factors within the very concept of the market. Actually, I think this is one of the biggest contribution of this book, as the title shows, the margins of the market. The terminology of the margins actually refers to how you reconceptualize the concept of market. And I think that's reminds me of what we have been learned, based on Timothy Mitchell's elaborations on the concept of the economy. Just like he said, he historicized the economy as a discursive product that was formalized and abstract in the 19th century. So it's like the attempt or the tendency to try to draw a line between something outside of the economy and something within the economy, and those regulated and abstracted practice finally consists of what we have been very familiar with, the economy. And things, I think, plays a similar tone in the market, or in this book, the free market that we have been understanding for, maybe since like the birth of the discipline of economics. So it's like the similar process, like the process of abstraction, homogenization, and also like central to this kind of process, it's like through different actions, like the standardization of the value, it contribute, and also like through the standardization of the value, it means like the labor has become an abstract form and which can be exchanged. I think this is kind of resembles the abstract labor Marxist has once mentioned. So here all these kind of things, this kind of regulation, redefinition, contestation, they actually marked the margins, the boundaries of the market, and ultimately it contributes to the capitalism as what we have been understand, the very concept today. So I think this is the first thing I found interesting. The fictionality of the concept of market. And the second thing I found very interesting is the fictionality of the territorial sovereignty in this book. Like last week, when we discussed the book on the fluid jurisdictions, I think Professor Yakya, she, from her viewpoint, she might not found like the sea as sphere can kindly free from the coercive power. Here, I think like from this book, I might feel like the free power, or the free agency within the Arabian Sea through your description of the human trafficking networks and also the smugglers, or many things. And I think it's very interesting because like the European colonial governments always they depict the sea similar following the logic of the land-based territory logic. So like within that imagination, the territory, even though it's sea, is imagined as like an empty, homogeneous space with like the very bounded but also fictional lines, and all these kind of fictional lines has made up with a unitary sovereignty in the colonial imagination. However, I think this book offers us an alternative to view this kind of colonial imagination. I think this is very good. So these are my two responses of short comments, and let's quickly jump to the questions. I have one question related to the concept you've been used in this book. It's like the indentured labor. It's indentured labor, and you randomly discuss or describes its relationship with the dates, and I think dates has become a very important topic when we are discussing the history of capitalism, and because in the Marxist economic thought, or Marxist school of thought, they have been carefully or critically trying to distinguish between the different concepts of, slavery or like forced labor or like indentured labor. So if it's possible for you to like elaborate more on like how would you view the relationship between dates and indentured labor, because like at least from what I have been read from this book, you might not want to consider the indentured labor as the same thing as, slavery. And also, this book, I think it mainly reviews like the negative impact of the date. And I think like what we have been assigned another book, I think you also write a review about it, the WRCHR's book, A Sea of Dates. And I think like she kind of provides an alternative perspective, of course, on the date, credit and the date relationship. Maybe prior to the arrival of colonial modernity, and maybe you could also provide some source upon this kind of credit or dates. This is my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yudan. That's fantastic. Shams?
First of all, thank you so much. I need to say this book, I enjoy a lot reading it, and then it's like, time passes, but I don't realize when I'm reading it. But also, so I will first go into your statement about gender. The incidents I think about gender dynamics when, in a particular section, you're trying to say the fraternal bonds of merchant network. In the incidents of when I look in your sources, when like the stepmother go to the court with his two sons because they're trying to argue, and then the woman cannot really find the merchant network adaptable to her when she's trying to run the business, right? So maybe like in the archive there are incidents of these that can be analyzed further, trying to say how this masculinity built in this network of merchant networking, or we go, as you say, there's like a hyper-masculinity going on in the sea. And saying that, I think this is a really good opportunity of trying to say, let's go beyond land territorial colonial regimes and trying to look at what the sea is doing. And as Eden said, there may be like the sea has a free agency. Maybe like for me that might explain why statistic deviation is so large that frustrate colonial officials so much at this time period, because they failed to collect everything, right? And then on top of what you say that you may not address the inequality between slaves and the merchant networks, I do think there's something go beyond colonial versus merchant, which is, for example, there are local government involvement in this process, and then there are British merchants who are also involved in this process, which sometimes they are subject to, their dependence of the local trafficking or how they eventually got into the rules of these opaque networks are really some fascinating spots to be analyzed. And then this book is particularly easy to read for me because nothing is old. It's still contemporary. All the strategies and all the stuff you say is still like resonate as people trying to do whatever they might do right now. And then in terms of framing out, I feel like there's also a naming process within the framing out. Like you're trying to name, not you, the colonials name the illicit as piracy and then name the illicit as self-defense. And at the same time, they self-hammering the definition of what's being piracy or what's being self-defense. And then at the same time, the merchants actually have the chance to be the intermediaries, travel in between the boundaries, and became and can exploit from all these definitions. And then I will go into my questions. Number one will be like how this is a particularly fascinating location and period in terms of state formation during these. We don't call them city-states or ports, but they're like smaller one that doesn't really fit the European Westphalian definition that the European system trying to impose them on. So number one is just I was more interested in like how like the local states react to this model of sovereignty that Western trying to project to them, even if they think they're not there yet. So they sort of surrender their sovereignty to the colonial state, where they're forced to be surrendered. Or the definition of violence, for example, how violence is framed out to be a state-only authority for protecting property rights, right? So how do the local states react to it, or like how do they adapt to it, or how if they just refuse to adapt it and they even become the shelter of illicit networks? And then the second one would be, so I personally see a conflict between colonial power dynamic, the aim for being the aim of domination, and then between colonial commercial interests. So at one point, it's like, you know, like how this free market, this facade, is built on this such intensive regulation and monitoring. So is there explanation of this? Can we say it's purely materialistic, where like the states are behaving on the behalf of merchants who are trying to like earn profits and earn domination? Or can we say this is an ideological pursuit that people are like they firmly believe this is the way of governing, and then this is the way eventually lead to a free market? Or going back to performatility, that we don't even need the explanation, because if this is a result of how things, like this loopy reaction-action process that result eventually to this configuration of reality due to the context of this Arabian Sea and how colonial trying to impose their rule in a different environment. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shams. Fantastic. All right, Johan, I'll give you a few minutes to maybe respond to some of these questions.
Thank you for really great questions and comments. It's really sort of productive to kind of think through these issues. Let me see how is best for me to kind of answer them. Maybe I'll start from the end and then work my way back. So yeah, the sort of question of this, what is the relationship between colonial business enterprise and the colonial state itself? And there's a sort of old debate in imperial history, which is does the flag follow the business, or does the business follow the flag, right? Is it sort of commercial interests that are pulling the state kind of unwillingly out into sort of conquering places, or is the state kind of in the lead and businesses kind of follow in its wake? And the resolution that I think I buy into is the idea that sort of division is a false division, right? I mean, this is also kind of Timothy Mitchell and Foucault and other people, right? State society, state market is an analytical kind of construct that shapes the world because we talk about it that way, but really, and we know for a fact, right, that these business leaders enter into government and leave government, and they're on committees, they're on councils or commissions in a kind of semi-formal fashion that then shape policy, and they're all, getting together at the Reform Club and, or whatever, some these clubs in London, or at the Gymkhana in Bombay or Delhi, and they're chatting over whiskeys, and they're talking about these things. So these two things are going together, and they're sort of reinforcing each other. I think. Yeah, it's hard, I think, to really sort of say one is really sort of at the lead. But I do think that this at least quite vague idea of free trade is something that does motivate, everyone involved, right? And that the British officials see themselves as the empire of free trade, right? There's a book about how, right, the sort of anti-slavery movement in Britain is partially a kind of justification, an attempt to gain the moral upper hand, to go around freeing places, right? Let's free everyone and give them free trade, which kind of sort of hides, to the side all of the sort of exploitation and other things that are going on. And the key story, I think, in the Indian Ocean, which is not necessarily the case in a lot of other places, is that there is a thriving world of commerce there. And one in which European businesses cannot sort of easily insert themselves in. There's always this idea that, well, they're just obviously technologically superior, but actually the fact is that the technologies are not very useful to these particular places or whatever. They need the state to come in and say, like, no, you don't do this. And when no, you don't do this, and these people become smugglers or pirates, right, then it opens up a vacuum for right, the free trade of colonial business to come in and take a dominant sort of position. But I'm, and this will sort of lead back, this question of the power, what is the power of the empire? And I think people take different sort of views, and obviously empires are more and less powerful in different places and different times. But I tend to think that we tend to overplay the power of the British Empire, and that the British Empire is often much more dependent upon, and European businesses are also much more dependent upon all of these other people right underneath them than we usually give credit for, because it's also a little bit unseemly to talk about the people. Partha Chatterjee kind of talks about this, right? The people who will go on to become the anti-colonial leaders are, of course, from precisely the class of people who benefit the most from colonialism. And there's a large population of people who benefit a great deal from colonialism. And I think, many of the people that I'm talking about in this book belong to that kind of category of people. Now, some of them are these princes, the princely states, or the sheikhs in the Gulf, and various sort of smaller rulers, and they are ultimately, it seems to me, trying to, by hook or by crook, hold on to whatever power they can. And the general rule of thumb that I think unfolds in this history as I see it is if you push back too strongly, if you're really like anti-colonial in the 19th century, you will be crushed and replaced, right? Whereas if you kind of like play the game and kind of say like, yes, we'll do this, but then you kind of do something else along the side, you can last a lot longer and continue to wield power as long as you kind of keep your mouth shut and go to the darbar and praise the queen and all these sorts of things. There's actually much more power that those sorts of figures continue to wield. I can't remember now if it's in this book or if it's in an article that I've written, but like there are these figures who you see make this explicit shift from pirates to rulers, and it's a very nice shift for a lot of these, because piracy is often hard work, right? You got to go out and like capture a ship and risk dying, and instead you have a nice treaty with the British where you say, often that the British will pay you to not attack their ships, right? What does that say about power, right? I mean, it's sort of interesting idea, and it's actually a notion of power that is much more frequent. Certainly, I see it in the way that the Sultan of Muscats dealt with their subordinate tribes, right? That the ruler pays their subordinates in order for their loyalty. That the idea that sovereignty and money flow downwards is different from our sort of modern sort of Western conception of how the money and the power should go. But I think that's actually something that's a very real part of how empire kind of penetrates, especially in these kinds of more marginal places where there's not as much money to be made, but you still want to keep things under control. The sort of idea that the framing out is a naming process, I think is absolutely right, and it's also a legal process, right? It's a process of law making and of creating certain kinds of distinctions, not only between the legal and the illegal, but between different categories of things that are taxed in different ways and regulated in different ways. I'm often a little bit hesitant to kind of venture into the world of legal history, which has its own kind of literature and debates and these sorts of things, and I do economic history, or I do, that's my bailiwick is the market, and I sort of, and that's, I think, problematic in some ways, because you can't, all of these legal categories are actually really important, but it's also strategic in my part to sort of say that this is an area where I feel comfortable in making interventions and those kinds of things, and there's a whole other set of people who are sort of exploring those kinds of questions. Fahad Bashar, so Fahad Bashar is my friend, and I sort of say, you do legal stuff, I'll do this stuff, and that we can sort of stay out of each other's hair is kind of how I sort of see some of that working. And interestingly, this idea of the way that male networks and fraternal networks sort of are the kind of barriers, right, that women face from sort of entering into these spaces. There are many other barriers as well, but those are the barriers that we still have with us today, right? I mean, even if legally there are no barriers, those kind of social networks that are structured around sort of homosocial spaces continue to have power and sort of constrain how certain, not just women, but certain types of men also are kind of excluded from that kind of power. And by the way, my partner is writing a whole thing about John By that I have a little paragraph or something about it, but it's a whole case, and if you're interested, she'll be publishing a book, I don't know, sometime soon about that particular figure and this family of this famous merchant Tarya Topan and his sort of much maligned wife. So keep your eyes out. Then so debt, indentured labor, slavery. I mean, so I think the way that that the sort of traditional sort of division between slavery and wage slavery, as even Marx sort of talked about it, is very important, but it's much more fluid and much more blurry than I think a lot of kind of orthodox doctrinaire kind of Marxism really kind of admits. I think like there's quite sophisticated Marxist literature that I think takes a much more sophisticated take on free labor and wages and how they sort of connect to these things. But to me that's clear that that it is a very fluid spectrum between the sort of commoditized human body in like 18th century Haiti, like that is worked to death like on a sugar plantation, and that moves within the context of Atlantic slavery, right, into many more sort of subtle forms of dominance, and then right, indentured labor, and this is the literature on indentured labor is all about this question about like, is indentured labor a new form of slavery, and the fact that indentured laborers literally went and moved into the houses that the slaves like worked in Trinidad or Jamaica or what have you, and I don't want to say that they're the same. They're not the same, right? Like the sort of that those forms of ownership are important, and the particular racial dynamics, particularly in the Atlantic, are also really important. But a lot of people don't know this, and something I discovered in doing my recent research. Africans were also indentured laborers, and we don't think about them in that form, but they're segments of the population in places like Jamaica actually arrived there after the end of slavery as indentured laborers coming from Angola or what have you, and so it gets very kind of hairy and complex, but I think to me it's precisely the point that like making those distinctions often gets us into trouble. I mean, as scholars, we have to kind of make those distinctions just to be vaguely comprehensible. But to me, and I think this is true of a lot of the literature, especially on Indian Ocean slavery, is that this is a very sort of subtle and complex and often contradictory set of relationships, and I think part of what I'm doing now with these questions of human capital is also to think about that, right? How much is what is a human being's value, right? And that begins right in slavery, right? When you value human beings and the productivity of human bodies, and that continues till today, right? And why is it that we think that Elon Musk is productive of billions of dollars of value when it looks like he's not a very smart fellow? So these are sort of deep questions that are both historical but also kind of very much shape our present. And both of you kind of asked this question about is the sea more free? Is the sea a sort of space of empowerment? I think it is a place where almost obviously territorial forms of sovereignty are harder to implement, and in that sense, yes, it's a space that is it is harder for governments and rulers to control people on the sea than it is on land, and some of that is just a question of the sheer expanse of it, right? And it's as true of vast expanses of land, right? The Siberian steppe, and places like that. Also, the desert, right? The Sahara, right? Operates, I think, in similar kinds of ways. But that doesn't mean that power isn't exerted. And often it seems to me, and I think this is from Foucault, right? States that are weaker are the ones that feel the need to impose more violence, right? And so I think that's something that we see at sea, right? Is that, you know, for the British Empire to enforce its will, it goes in and seizes things and stops people and arrests people to a greater extent than it often has to do, at least in sort of you know, sheer like per capita basis than on the land, because their power is weaker. And you know, this is what Ranjit Guha calls dominance without hegemony, right? There is power being exerted, but the inability to actually shape people's mindsets, right? And so I think that's something that you see in amongst these kinds of interventions at sea is you actually see a considerable amount of violence and power sort of exerted, but that's often as much a sign of weakness as it's a sign of power. And the last thing, just on Timothy Mitchell and sort of the economy, you know, I was deeply influenced by Mitchell in this sort of work, and I was trying to sort of apply it in this sort of more maritime kind of context. But one of the things that I sort of wish that I had said more is the notion of performativity, which is like Austin is the guy who talks about like speech acts, right? So I dump the night, you know, when you say something, you're doing something. And then to Calon, who I talk about sort of reasonably, sort of substantially as kind of, right, economics creating its own world. I've been critiqued at some level that like, that's not what I'm doing. That's not what's happening in the story that I have here, right? And one of the ways that I was thinking of performativity is actually Judith Butler's ideas about performativity of gender, right, and of gender roles that are constantly policed and constantly trespassed, right? Those lines are not, man or woman is a blurry line, but one that is constantly reinforced. And that's, I think, what's happening in the story that I'm telling, right? What is a slave and what is a free wage labor? It's no one knows, right? But that's a category that matters because everyone is trying to work their way either to sort of enforce that to their benefit or to sort of work around it, right? So it's that's the kind of performativity that I think is really at work in what I'm doing in this book. And so yeah, I'll just use that as an opportunity to say that. So.
Thank you so much, Johan. Let's take a 5-minute break till 18, and I'll be very strict on that so we can get as much use out of the hours that we have. So please get back here in 5 minutes, or maybe just stretch in place. But we'll take a short break. Thank you, guys. All right, thank you, everyone. Back from the break. All right, so the way we're going to run this session is basically, as I said earlier, an extended Q&A. And kind of a space for reflection and discussion on the book. So let's start out with thoughts, questions on the book itself. And then for the second round, I'll open up a lot more space for the second project. So yeah, questions from the audience, yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the brief but productive and promising talk. and I love how the book has like neatly weaved into the social fabric, the colonial fabric of like domination and policy making, especially like the British officials, they themselves have fallen into the trap of like commissions, counseling, and other like consumption, and how like the colonial officials have like their preconceived assumption of abolishing slavery, but at the same time they maintained their like imperial maintenance, not through the market, not through like the prosperity of their market or their like state, but more about like through trafficking and other non-material transactions in the colony. And also like you also like touch upon but not flesh out that in detail about the interactive individuals, like the importance of interactive between the British officials, the brokers, and the local local rulers like this, in order to make the culture thinner, not thicker as Clifford Geertz has demonstrated in his the anthropology, ethnography like this thing. So I think it's very important to like tease out this kind of like details about like the different actors, these political actors and colonial the colonized. So we have to break up the binary of the colonized and colonial like this. Yeah. So I have two questions, which are in tandem with religion in itself, Islamic law like this. So the first one is I read chapter 2 on the book, and you talk about like how there was a tension between the naval officers of the British and the local rulers, and how the treaties condoned domestic slaveholding because the institution of slavery was enshrined in the Quran, was regulated by the Islamic law, and hence did not appear to partake of the dehumanizing extremes of Atlantic slavery. So, from my understanding of the Islamic law, I don't know what you were mentioning about the Sharia or the more ethical, framework. So, according to the law, it's permissible to have slaveries as long as you have this just and other value-laden terms, justice and equality like this. So I'm interested in how the ethics and the moral worldview can play into this the whole contextual conditions of the slave possession or the slave holding. So does religion itself, Islamic law as a way of life, and also the regulation of the Muslims' very identity, play a crucial role in the attitude toward trafficking slavery? So how does this ethical background can foreground this information? And the second question is very interactive of this, and also about the Mecca, how the sacred sites of the Muslims, the Mecca and the Medina, have been emphasized as a site for many brokers use the Hajj or the pilgrimage as an opportunity to realize a profit on their slaves. In contrary, for many Muslims, and also before you said many brokers, used as a profit, but as many Muslims, this transaction appeared in a completely different light. Many meeting a slave while performing the Hajj was considered a particularly pious need for pilgrims. So, how do these many Muslims and also many brokers can also play a role in this? Because from what I read, those many Muslims, they think they have their moral grounding of purchasing and also trafficking the slaves without their assumed injustice or inequality between the human capitals, between slaves and their possessors. So what are the whole ethical worldview playing out in all of this? And as we mentioned about the values, but not about price tags, but also the values of your justice, and also the whole to deconstruct and debunk this loopholes of the capitalism. So how does this ethics play a role in this? Because you did not flesh out this more. You only mentioned regulation of Islamic law or the Sharia. I'm not sure. So yeah.
All right. Other questions?
Hold on a second.
Is it good enough?
Quite good.
Joao?
So talking about the tension between the British authorities and the merchants who the slave traders who after abolition were still enslaving people and taking them through the Arabian Sea. I want to ask about the question of race, which is obviously a big important part in this slave trade, especially in the deceptive methods used while resisting to the British authorities, and also the British authorities. For example, the example you give that the British authorities at a certain point were only looking for African enslaved people, and because of that, then the slave traders start changing who they are enslaving. So, as in like, race is central to this. And my question is, well, if you could talk more about this, but also specifically regarding your possible regrets that you were speaking about in the beginning. To ask if it's a regret or not, or if it's just something that came through your mind to engage, because you don't mention racial capitalism in this, but obviously the structure that encompasses both this, as you said, the perception and the methods of avoiding this perception are deeply ingrained in a racial capitalist structure, as race is defining all these tensions. So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my question is pretty speculative and I'm going to try my best to articulate it. So Timothy Michel sort of tries to deconstruct the binaries as abstractions from within, to say that, these binaries sort of coexist with their opposite, right? So the present sort of coexists in its very orientation with the absence. So counter argument to that kind of paradigm comes from somebody like Aaron Jakes, who was here a couple weeks ago. He says that we already live within abstractions, right? So this kind of dichotomy between abstractions and reality does not really sustain itself. So I was just wondering about your idea of human capital and the embodiment of this abstraction called capital. Right, so I was wondering if that could be a counter argument to Aaron Jakes' kind of, proposition, where we actually look at the embodiment of this abstraction, right? So it sort of becomes real, pretty capable, sort of almost becomes agentive in that sense, right? As opposed to just staying an abstraction, a freewheeling signifier. It sort of comes down to the realm of the signified and sort of becomes real. So I was just wondering if you could just talk a little more about that. This is pretty speculative. I'm sorry if I'm just pushing you to, yeah, thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Adam?
So I might be oversimplifying things, but I've been wondering about this for the whole series, so I'm just going to ask. And it connects to something you were mentioning earlier about the weakness of the colonies, of empires, and the fact that they do depend on colonial subjects. Do you think this is the reason, and this is might be simplistic, but you think this is the reason why at the end of the day, we see so often colonial policies enduring in post-independence context, and so it originates as a colonial weakness, but at the end of the day, it's also the strength of colonial policies. I mean, co-opting, I guess, colonial elites. Yeah.
I have a bit of a semantic question. So, in the conclusion, you're talking about how these trafficking networks sort of preceded the free market. I'm using your words right now. And only by framing out they become these illicit things. So I guess semantically my question is, does it really make sense to call them trafficking networks if the fact that they're trafficking is only a production of them becoming illicit? And I guess going along that, outside of just semantic nitpicking, I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of pre-capital histories or moving capitalist histories, because I know I don't really have a set idea on them, but I think your book does kind of touch onto those things, but doesn't fully get there. So I wonder if you wanted to inch that out.
I have just a comment to this empire question, or because I slightly disagree what was presented here with regard to empire, because I think empires are very important for the development of civilization, and it allows stability, it allows the development of law, it allows the shared labor, basically science, development of science and art. But what is the critical part of empire is monopolies. And with the development of the monopolies, you have inefficiency in the system. And that's what you see where the empire thrives, is actually developing of new ideas. And that is actually facilitated by the development of empires. But where empires fail, and they normally collapse in themselves, is the inefficiency and building of boundaries. And what we see at the moment very much directives, regulations, and that's a protectionism which I associate with monopolism. And then, of course, you get the colonialism and all those isms around the empire, which I think then it's the first stage of collapsing.
Thank you so much for a wonderful book and a great presentation. Really excited about your upcoming book project. So one of the things that we've been discussing quite a bit in class and in the public seminar is the extent to which a kind of conceptual Atlanticism, right? So concepts that derive from the Euro-Atlantic experience. Specifically, let's say concepts that come alongside racial capitalism, may or may not be adequate for understanding other regions of the world. So the Indian Ocean is a sort of case in point. But what was really fascinating about chapter 2 in your book is that it's not just that this legacy, this kind of baggage that we have from the Atlantic skews historical understanding of the Indian Ocean. But what you're telling us is that, these colonial, I was going to say bureaucrats, but people on the ships, the abolitionists, right, themselves were plagued with a kind of conceptual Atlanticism, I'm just going to call it that, right? So a particular idea of what a slave is, a particular conception of slavery, which made them unable to recognize slavery when they saw it. For example, the case that you mentioned is two Indian children, two Indian boys. They didn't actually recognize that as slavery because they had certain preconceptions. So I was wondering whether you would say that we see performativity here, right? Because ultimately it seems that you're arguing, if I've understood you correctly, that practices around slavery then came to actually mirror these conceptions, these Atlantic-centered conceptions that the abolitionists had when they were trying to look out for slaves. So I think that's a fascinating point, and I really think it kind of takes our discussion further. So I think I'll stop there, and I've got some other questions for the second round.
All right, let's have Martine's question.
So thank you again so much. So it was interesting that you talked about social reproduction in the context of your new project, and I was just wondering if you had reflected on where it might have fitted into this book, because I was thinking one of the things I loved about this is how the category of labour is premised on rendering other forms of labour invisible, or sort of rendering it as slavery or as child labour or as just being a family member. And so does the category of, is this where we see social reproduction coming in, where one site for this division between labour and social reproductive labour or non-labour? Because usually it's often cited in these sort of diffusionist models within Europe, especially within Britain. So can we use this as a way to see another site for social reproductive, these sort of lines being drawn?
Thank you. Okay, so not much to think about, really.
Yeah.
Handing it to you.
Yeah, this is all just fantastic. Okay. Okay, so Yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think this sort of, and I think this kind of goes back to the first question as well, right? The domestic slavery is not really slavery because it's not doing productive things, right? They're not growing sugar, they're caring for people, and so. I think you're absolutely right that those forms of work kind of hide forms both of labor and of exploitation, right? And a lot of people have talked about the way that peasants, exploit their families, right, in order to keep up with increasing demands on their sort of profits or their ability to support themselves, right? That's a move is sort of involution, right, to sort of more intensely exploit your family is something that peasant historians have talked about for some time. But this sort of space of like the domestic slave is kind of not a problem, right? Because they're not that different from how our wives should be, right? They should be basically our slaves. I think that is framing what's going on here, and that those forms of exploitation are in a sense acceptable, and so that's absolutely sort of, I think, shaping what's going on, certainly in the ideas about sort of slavery and domestic slavery.
I should say that it's going to be very hard for you to answer all the questions.
Okay.
So feel free to jump around
Okay.
if you would like, and kind of pick out themes and stuff.
Conceptual Atlanticism. I think that's right, and that's kind of the idea is you have these people at these times who have ideas about what is free labor and what is free trade. So this is where, and I'll try to. I think this sort of goes in with the sort of questions about Aaron Jakes, right? A lot of what I'm doing in this book is about seeing how ideas sort of filter down and shape the world imperfectly, but they sort of shape the world. And I think and I love Aaron's work, and you can read a very glowing review that I wrote of his book. But I think he's more interested in a lot of I think people who are doing kind of Marxist intellectual history are looking at how the world is sort of the economy is shaping thought, right? And I think they're looking at, they're much more sophisticated in this, but it's a sort of base superstructure kind of story. And I think ideas are actually coming down and shaping things. And to me, that is a really important part of understanding why capitalism spreads, right? That capitalism has this power because people take these ideas and then they say, okay, why isn't the world like this? The world should be like this, right? And in some ways it's good. Like, the end of slavery is a good thing, right? Let's all, I think we can all agree about that. But it has all of these kind of knock-on effects. So, I think that this is in a different kind of way a real abstraction, right? It's an idea that kind of it's an abstract idea that filters down into reality rather than a sort of abstraction that emerges organically out of the capitalist marketplace and forces us to think in terms of abstract labor and these sorts of things. So, that's not how Marxists would use the term, but that, I think we can think about those as just sort of, and both of those matter. Like, I'm not saying that, the real world doesn't shape the way we think. It absolutely does, but it's a two-way street, right? And I think that's what performativity kind of does for me, right? It's how do these ideas actually infect the world that we live in. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to get here. Okay, so two questions about empire and whether empire is weak or strong. And you're very right to sort of say, like, what about the fact that we're still living with empire? I think that's a very important question. I don't want to belittle the effect of empires. They've been enormously powerful. One thing is to say they've been more powerful in certain spaces and times and places than others. But the other is to say on certain kinds of people, right? And so, yeah, I think, right, the fact that Jawaharlal Nehru, who goes, is, Trinity College, Cambridge, and, he's just as shaped by all of these ideas that I'm talking about as any British man, right? And so those ideas have power, and they filter, right, across racial lines and across ethnic lines, and then they get put into laws, right? And then those laws, right, last longer than the empires that sort of created them. And that's a kind of obvious way that empire sort of goes on, but by the same token, right, we a lot of economists talk about informal economies, right? So everywhere in the developing world has very large informal economies, right? And the developed world has much smaller informal economies. And to me, that space of the informal economy is a relic of the fact that, like, things didn't come down that far, right? They came down to a certain level, but they didn't go all the way down, right? And that's the sort of notion of, that's the sort of, like, real Foucauldian hegemony in, like, structuring the way we think. I don't think a lot of that was happening. Certainly in the world that I'm looking at. But I think even, right, a herder in Tanzania, right, I think is shaped far less by these ideas and by these structures than Jomo Kenyatta was, right? So I think that's the kind of story. The question of empires are powerful, and they leave these legacies, and I think there's this whole book was written 90% on the back of things that colonial people wrote, right? And in spaces constructed by, I'm not at all denying the power of colonialism, but I would also question whether, is monopoly a kind of incidental piece of empire, or is it sort of right?
If you look at the history of empire, it's always collapsed as soon as they monopolize things.
Right, but that's in some sense the point of empire, right? Is it's control, and I think you can have. I don't think that you could have an empire that doesn't do that.
Control is different than monopoly.
That's fair, but the British Empire didn't have a lot of trade monopolies, right, after the end of the East India Company, right? So you've got an empire that lasts, a century, that is explicitly built on the freedom of the market, and yet, right, there is still a great deal of power, often, very subtly sort of exercised. And often, right, in ways that operate more along the lines of ideas and of laws that are able to control without creating monopolies. And the British Empire is very explicitly a sort of empire that is devoted to the freedom of markets and to competition. And you see that in the colonial documents, that is something that they want. It's not something they always deliver, but there's a big difference that way between the British Empire and the Portuguese, and really any empire that comes earlier. And yet it has, I think, then a very different set of problems, and a different set of engagements than empires that are more devoted to questions of monopoly. The Ottoman Empire is the same way, right? I mean, the Ottoman Empire is not going in and trying to, certainly in the 19th century, right? It's all about sort of freeing up things. So I think it's a complicated story. Okay. Race. So part of this is, I would say, part of my hesitance to talk too explicitly about race is about a fear of conceptual Atlanticism, right? It's certainly in the U.S. Academy, it's hard to talk about race and not have it be a relatively simplistic binary, right, of black and white. And that I think we should keep talking about that, forever, and that's very important, and there's and that's sort of essential work. But I think conceptually, I think we can make a much more capacious and complicated notion of race and deploy it. But I think it's hard to get out of the discourse that we have, right? And so that was a battle that I wasn't going to fight, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot more that could be done with that. And part of this is like, I didn't read Cedric Robinson until after, writing this book. And so, some of it is also, I think, the literature and the scholarly discourse has expanded quite much more substantially in the time since I wrote this. That's part of the story. And it will be more of the story that I'm sort of working on in the future. But it's also, right, how do you deal with the problem of, right, the Arab sort of slave, an Arab person owning an African person, an Indian person exploiting an Arab person, right? I mean, this is where, and of course within racial lines, right, exploitation. It's so interlocking and intersecting, and I want to be attentive to all of those nuances. I often feel like thinking about that in terms of race is very hard, just because of the very important work that we still have to do to deconstruct and reduce the power of racism in our society. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Sorry, I'm just going all over the place.
Do you think we can start?
Okay, sure, yeah.
Okay, we'll give Johan a bit of a break, and then maybe you can come some back to some of these questions with the other questions. All right, so I'm going to open it up, but before I do that, I'll actually use the prerogative of the chair to ask a few questions. So I have 3 questions for you. First is conceptual, and the other 2 are kind of processual. So the first one is coming back to this question around performativity and abstraction. I guess I was curious. I mean, it's clear to me that you're sort of building on various. I mean, I really like the conceptual framework that you built around performativity, which I also use in my own work, and kind of see where you're going with it. But I also wondered if there was something specific, and I think you kind of started to touch on this, but I wanted to push a little bit more about thinking about these concepts on the margins, right? There's a way in which so much writing that happens in the kind of territorial landscape of land, and the making of kind of national economies and so on, that I think works very differently on these margins. And I wondered if you could push a little bit more on like what going to the Arabian Sea, what using that geography adds to our kind of conceptualization of performativity in that kind of, in the making of markets in that way. The other 2 questions are more kind of just questions about how you conceived both the first and the second project. So the first one, I mean, I think it's so interesting to see how you organize the book around these different almost, it's these spheres, right? The DAOs, the slavery, the kind of weapons trafficking, etc. And I guess my question was, how did you get to that kind of, just for us as people who are writing books and thinking about how to organize, how did you processually get to which spheres you were going to focus on, and how you were going to organize the books around them? Because these kinds of, especially, it's interesting because you're both kind of working with chronology, space, and objects, right? So I guess I was kind of curious how you worked with that, or what led you to that kind of organization of the book, which I think is fabulous, but want to just kind of hear more. And related to that, for your second project, now it sounds like you're doing a lot with kind of human labor, and you're taking a focus on reproductive aspects of it, which I think is really interesting. But I was curious kind of where geography sits in that project, because you have a huge edge as someone who is clearly very attuned to geography, to the materiality of things, and so on. And how does that fit and kind of shape how you're looking at labor and human capital? So these are my questions. All right, opening it up to others. Oh, yeah.
I just have like a small question related to your current working on project. You mentioned you just found those records like composed by women about like their experience using the nicotians or opiums within the family, within the domestic sphere. I kind of consider this kind of writing is very private. So like, through which way, like how did you find these kind of sources? Because I'm imagining that is not the resources like you will go to a state archives or like a city archive. You might be able to find those kind of things, because like the history of like drugs or medicines, those works like I have been read, like they have a tendency to acquire the archives materials like based on the seeing like a state, the state narrative, and also like they might rely heavily upon the medical records or legal records. For example, like about the discourse of homosexuality or like the psychoanalysis, for example. So like, how did you find these kind of very specific, very fabulous materials? This is my question.
Thank you. Yes, Johan.
So one question I had in reading this wonderful book is, throughout the text, you look at slaves as commodities in sort of the framing of your argument and your discussion. However, within your research and sort of during the archival process and the archival research process, do you see any voices that emerge from the slaves themselves as human beings within this narrative, and how they perhaps conceive of themselves within these markets and within these market frameworks, and sort of the perception of themselves as being commodities and commodified in terms of their labor, or in terms of being purchased or sold, or being moved around as objects?
Do you have a question?
I've got a couple. We'll just ask one, but which one to ask? Well, actually, one's a follow-up from what I said before. We had a workshop by the same name last year, the Histories of Capitalism and Race, but it wasn't specifically focused on the Middle East. But we had a speaker who seemed to make the claim, if I remember correctly, that abolitionism created slavery. in the context that she was looking at in India. And that got a lot of pushback. It was a very provocative comment. And so sort of building on my comment earlier, I don't think that's exactly what you're saying or showing us, but there is a way in which the abolitionists sort of produce what they expect to see, right? And they sort of kind of worsen conditions. So kind of going back to, the whole idea of the performativity of economics is that it produces the reality it claims to have been simply describing. I would just be curious to hear you maybe talk a little bit about that. Partially because also in my own research, when I look at the movement towards abolishing slavery in Ottoman Egypt and Sudan in particular, I've also noticed ways in which what they were claiming to try and outlaw ended up becoming worse, I suppose, is just the simplest way of putting it, through making it sort of illicit. But there was also a case of trying to capture trade, right, which I think you also gesture at. So you're pushing us to not think of the slave trade, not kind of reify the slave trade as this thing that is happening in isolation on slave ships in the way that we've seen perhaps with the Atlantic experience, but as something that is embedded in multiple ways, but amongst those ways is just in other forms of sort of trade. And so are you also making this argument that part of this mission to sort of capture this Indian Ocean trade involved abolition as one way to be able to kind of intervene in the power of sort of local traders? And so just one effect of that has been the production of these very clear sort of binary categories. So I'll stop there with that question, and if there's a silence, I'll come back with my last question.
All right, 2 last questions.
I was just following up from this, how do you get the data around the female and also the object aspect of things? Because I think you see a very much different picture of females when females have a voting rights. So basically the female not being the objects, because as in most societies, especially when you look at the British empires, it was no independence for the female. And I grew up under the communist part, and female were at least legally equal. And there you see, especially in the black market economy, where they had a really free market, a lot of female, but in the fence position, so not in the active smuggling position, but in the fencing position, so having huge networks of distribution. And that's what I believe is also the female role in a society where you have actually independence, material independence. You have the famous first wife of Muhammad, I think, very much independent and very much in control of the trade and of what was going on in their household. And you have the same thing in females in the old Hanse Kontors, where they are basically the bankers for their husbands who are overseas. And so there the female position is much, much stronger in this network.
Thank you. Mathew?
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more. I love this theme of visibility that ran throughout the book, but the relationship between visibility and boundary making, which I know a lot of people, us who work on infrastructure, science and technology studies, this is a very important topic. And how, especially materiality, and how that's involved in both maintaining this boundary in effect and it breaking down. So I was wondering if, does materiality, do you think it figures in this particular boundary making? Is there something particular about this boundary making which makes materiality less consequential?
All right, excellent. I'll hand it over to you for a few.
Okay. So maybe I'll try it. So, yeah, I think materiality is absolutely essential to this, but it operates in a different way, right? It's not a sort of fixed infrastructure, right? A fence or a road or whatever. It's often about, so in the chapter on arms, I think you can see this really clearly, right? So like very subtle things about how the gun is manufactured have a huge role in whether it's a sporting weapon for shooting whatever, foxes, or it's an offensive weapon for attacking people, right? So that it comes down to, and then human beings, right? Right. So the materiality of the human body, right? The skin color, right? Scarification, like all kinds of bodily things become the marker of whether someone sort of fits in this category or that category, right? So it's there, but it operates in a very different sense than the kind of a territorial and built infrastructure kind of sense. I think I'm generally totally with you in this sort of notion that there is. I wouldn't say altogether, but there's certainly a way in which these kind of abolitionist movements, as they are actually worked out in practice, rather than what Wilberforce says in a speech in Parliament, have these kinds of effects. One of the most interesting things, and African historians have talked about this, is that in order to abolish slavery, the Europeans get together in Berlin or whatever, and they say you can't export guns to Africa, which then makes Africa, right, the colonization of Africa proper happens in a sense as a result of the abolition of slavery, right? Because that basically means people are disarmed within the sort of territories of Africa, which means that they do not then have the weapons that can fight back. Whereas, right, the WRCHRs or whoever have a slightly higher standing because they can import weapons from other places, and the Ethiopians are the key exception because they are able to import guns from Russia. And that is a big part of why they defeat the Italians in the famous Battle of Adwa, right? So the effort to say, we're this paternalistic, right, authority that we don't want you hurting each other, taking each other as slaves, becomes then a move of actually controlling things and then putting those people onto a plantation to grow cocoa or coffee, right? And so you see a lot of the things that you associate with kind of plantation slavery emerge in Africa and emerge in other parts of the world, right? As a kind of impact of the sort of larger effort to abolish slavery, but it's always these kind of strategic, practical, borderline decisions, right? It's not some grand conspiracy where they're like, ha 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 ha, we're going to do this. They're all these just little but it's a little bit too complicated to do that, so let's just do this, right? Those are the moments in which, right, you have these subtle moves which then work to kind of sort of create a certain kind of economy, and that's the other part of the story, which is I think slightly different than I think you're suggesting, which is that a lot of the horrors that we think of in terms of slavery are this kind of late moment of Atlantic slavery, a moment in which Atlantic slavery is deeply structured by European capital, right? Which is different than 16th century, 17th century even slavery, even in the Caribbean, even in sugar plantations, right? But because you have an economy that now is demanding certain kinds of very specific products at a sort of mass industrial scale, you have suddenly a demand for labor, right? That you didn't have before. And the late slavery in the U.S. South with cotton and with various other things is shaped by the Industrial Revolution, right? This is Eric Williams, right? But the same thing you sort of see emerging in Africa and in India, the rise of indentured labor. All of these sorts of things are tied to the greater expansion of capitalist forms of production, I think, all over. And that's not necessarily an effect of abolition per se. That is just, right, the effect, I think, of capitalist forms of production and accumulation. Sources and voices of slaves and voices of women. So there are a sort of very few and small set of sources where you have the voices of slaves, and they're almost always the product of abolitionists who want to know, often in a somewhat self-congratulatory vein, saying like, "We saved you. Tell us about your life." But of course, it's people who work on histories of slavery warn us against reading too much into slave narratives, right? Because there's a level of kind of ventriloquism in which the munificent abolitionist is speaking in the voice of the slave. And I know for sure in a lot of the sources that I have, right, there's a dialogue, right? There are questions asked, but the only thing we see is the answers that the slaves put back to us. So even the sources that we have, and they are precious and important, and we need to sort of do everything that we can with them. We have to take a somewhat sort of suspicious eye to that. But the interesting moments are often the ones where they sort of push back against the narrative. And that's, there's this one woman that I think I talk about who it was sort of confusing to me because she's this elite kind of royal slave, and she's manumitted, and then she's in Bombay, and she's she's basically saying, "Send me back home," and I can't tell if that home is Muscat or if it's Georgia. I don't know, right? The archives are vague on it, and it's certainly possible that she had an elite enough position that it was better to be there, and she, is abducted when she's 10 years old, that's the only world that she knows. Another sort of figure is a kind of labor contractor, right? Someone who is, created a community, right? And in India, in which he becomes a kind of benefactor to other manumitted slaves, and sort of constructs a sort of a small kind of window of agency or power, and so we see these sort of bits, but we also have to be skeptical, and so it's a very sort of complex process, and I think in any of these cases, we take as much as you can, but that you're on very shaky ground. So women are sort of different, right? Again, it's a question of which women, right? We have a lot more writing by sort of elite women than non-elite women, and certain European women, just because Europe is much more documented than other parts of the world. So the crazy thing that I've been looking at here is in the Royal Society, there are prescription registers. Basically, pharmacies write down what drugs they are selling to individuals. So I have Viscountess such and such is being, prescribed, morphine. A lot of these sort of things around sort of ideas about, especially, right, bourgeois elite women as kind of neurotic and whatever, right? You see that they're documented in the form of there's a weird amount of chloroform being prescribed to women in the 19-teens in Kensington, right? So there's these weird things like that you get right in London that I don't get in India. But so I don't have a lot of Indian factory woman tells me like what she's doing, but you have all of these. Often you have European women who go down to talk to those women to ask them what their life is like, and you have these kinds of accounts that are there, and you have kind of semi-ethnographic kinds of accounts. The other really this is why, you know, this goes to sort of your question about the geography of this new project, is I'm sort of being pulled away, well, not totally pulled away, but, you know, I'm doing more work on, I have one chapter on the US and one chapter on Europe. The US chapter is actually on Harlem, and domestic servants, like from the South and from the Caribbean who are working, and the great source there is that this is Harlem of the Harlem Renaissance. So we have autobiographies of women who start as domestic servants who end up as, Billie Holiday is this sort of like a classic case of this, of like someone who lives this incredibly brutal childhood in Baltimore and is basically brought up to New York to be a prostitute by her mother, right? She's involved in this sort of 1920s and 30s jazz scene in which she's, you know, smoking a lot of marijuana, and then makes her way to heroin, which like part of her then like self-destruction. But you have those really interesting sources when you have a few sets of people who are nothing and then become something, who are really incredible to kind of explore.
Maybe 2 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so then, yeah, so that kind of goes to your question of geography. The geography is still centered in the global South, right? I have, the way at least I'm thinking this book, it's going to be 7 chapters. Only one is kind of centered on people of European stock. But I think it's important, and I want that to be a chapter, because I sort of want to see this book is telling something about human bodies and an experience of labor that is simultaneously shared but also, right, distinct. And so I want it to be centered on, right, Indian women who are factory workers in the Bombay cotton mills, or African laborers from Mozambique who are working in the WRCHR mines. But that, right, working class soldiers dying in the trenches of the Western Front, being sort of dosed morphine as they kind of sit in a shell hole waiting for that. Like they're part of this story too, and their bodies are also shaped by these structures. So the way the project worked is actually I follow like a life cycle. So I start with birth and infancy, and these sort of women who are dosing their infants with opium, and then I move through sort of youth and labor and sex and old age and finally death, and each sort of chapter goes in a different sort of location, often a location that has been very well researched. I mean, this is why this is a second book, so you kind of like go crazy a little bit, but you also don't feel so bad about drawing on other people's amazing work. And I'm like amazed at the like level of scholarship that is there at the gold mines of WRCHR are like so well researched, and there's so much there that I can draw. I'm taking these very iconic places, right? Places where a lot of labor historians have actually done a lot of the groundwork, and I can like mine their footnotes and their sort of like asides to kind of write this book. And that's because it's a book that was rejigged in COVID, right? Suddenly I couldn't go to all the places that I wanted to go, and so I was like, how do I do this online? And that's kind of how it unfolded. Okay, yeah. Let's leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Johan. This was an incredible seminar. We got so much out of it. And